Well, tell us how
And
the way that they, I mean, exactly what it was the DOJ was saying that they were doing in terms of excluding blacks and Latinos from their housing units.
well, they had a color-coded system of files where when an applicant came in and was black, it went into a certain color folder. When someone came in that had a Latino name, it went into another kind of folder. And when white applicants came in, it went into another kind of folder. And some of the folders were never looked at again. And so they systematically discriminated. The case also, as a minor part of the case, pointed out that they basically didn't employ anybody who was black or Latin, or very few. And so there was also, when the Trump organization finally signed a consent decree, it also dealt with employment practices, which, by the way, they signed it and then violated it. They had to go back into federal court with it in the late 70s, in which the consent decree was finally enforced in some way. But they were not in compliance with it after a couple of years after initially signing it. So it was, and Donald's attitude, he would talk about this publicly, and Roy would do it in the case, which was to equate blacks and Latinos with welfare recipients and just say their defense was they were trying to keep welfare recipients who couldn't afford to live in a Trump building. Not that they're for rich people, but they welfare recipients. They just equated it and say we're trying to keep welfare recipients out and in the interest of our tenants. And, so that was the line of defense. And it was, an absurd defense, but that was what they offered.
It's interesting because it's the defense is pretty offensive in and of itself. Aside from it being, we're just trying to keep out welfare recipients. It sort of reminds me a little bit of like of that dynamic where Trump is like, my dad just gave me $1 million loan, where the real story is that in fact my dad made every deal at the beginning of my career, by backing everything up. I mean, do you find that in the course of your reporting then, and when you look back into it last cycle, is this a pattern? Has he figured out some dynamic here where it's like, I can get away with a murder if I cop to assault?
Well, it's almost axiomatic. I would think that even most Republicans believe, I'm talking about just voters believe, that he has a very remote connection to the truth. And, there's some people that doesn't bother so long as, white people are going to be back running the show again in a big and flashy way. And, but I think, these stories, look, I wrote in that very first series in the 70s that I did on him, and I asked him about it before I wrote it. He had this chicken or egg issue on his very first project, the Hyatt, because the city and the state were requiring that he have an option. Only would make sense before you convey public benefits to a developer to build something, that he would have an option on the site. On the other hand, Penn Central said, we want to see that the city is going to commit and the state is going to commit to this tax abatement, which was a brand new thing and had never been done before by the city or state. They conjured up a whole economic development program precisely for the Hyatt and for the Trumps. And so they said, well, we want to see that before we give you an option. So no one noticed, but I had foiled the city, and going through the city records, I see the option, and it's signed only by Donald. There's no signature there from anybody from Penn Central. So I wrote that in the story, and I asked him about it, and he flipped out about it at the time and all the rest of it. But years later, when he writes The Art of the Deal, he not only admits that he did that, but brags about what a stroke of genius this was to fraudulently convince the city of New York that he had an option that he didn't have.
Wow.
Now they were leaning over backwards to do anything. The Beam administration was leaning over. I can't be the only person who noticed it was unsigned, but I was, it was, the city had to have noticed, but they had just decided they were going to do this anyway. So yeah, there was an option in the file signed by one of two parties. And he later cited this as an example of the art of the deal.
And I wonder even if that was his idea. I mean, just so that people understand what the dynamic is here, is that the city and I guess maybe the state is willing to give a basically what we would consider like some type of like enterprise zone deal to Trump, but they needed to know that he had an option. He had the exclusive right or a right to build on this property that was owned by Penn, and Penn needed to know that he had access to these the special abatements from the state or the city so that they would get into business with him because they wanted to get a payoff. And I wonder if it was his idea to put in just his, a document with just his signature, or if somebody in the city said to him, just put the document in. Don't worry. We can, if the document's there, we can always say some clerk overlooked it. I wonder if it was his idea, but maybe we'll never know on that.
I don't think we will. I don't think will know. Maybe it was Fred's idea. Who knows?
All right. Well, lastly, Wayne, give me just a sense of like what you think. You were perhaps one of the sort of the premier muckraking reporters in New York City for decades. Give me your sense of what kind of job the media has done in terms of revealing Trump and what might be, from whence that came. I mean, because I think for a long time people just weren't taking him seriously.
Yeah, but I think print has done a reasonably good job. The Times has had 4 front page stories, all of which, including the one that ran on the women, I thought were pretty good stories. Some of them exceptionally good stories. Charlie Bagley did that story about the employees at Mar-a-Lago and how few of them were locals and most were Romanians, and an excellent story. And McIntyre did this story recently about Trump Soho that built off of some of the things I'd written back in 2011, but did just an extraordinary job, revealing, for example, that, and this is a project that Ivanka and Donald Jr. and Eric all have an interest in. And as I said in my story in 2011, Ivanka had said, told depositors and was so involved in the campaign to promote it that she'd said 60% of the units had been sold, when at that very time they had filed a report with the state attorney general saying that only 14% of the units had been sold. And so Cy Vance, according to McIntyre's story in the Times, was looking into whether or not the depositors had been fraudulently induced into making their investments in these units. And astonishingly, I have no idea why this isn't a big story, because astonishingly, on the front page of the New York Times, we learned that that Trump then settled with the depositors, paid millions of dollars to them, and part of the settlement explicitly said that they could not cooperate with the Manhattan District Attorney in his criminal investigation. So it's official hush money, and yet.
Can you do that? Can you do that? Can you pay?
I've never heard of anybody doing it.
Isn't that the definition of obstruction of justice? I mean,
I would agree with you, Sam. It's just an alarming story. I mean, I urge everybody that's listening to go back and read McIntyre's story in the Times. It's incredible, and what's even more incredible is it's never been mentioned on any cable news show. None of the Times stories or Herald's stories in the Washington Post. These are the 2 best papers in the United States. Herald did an extraordinarily good story about the Taj and how Trump lied under, now that's my word, I don't think he uses that word, but certainly testified before the Casino Control Commission that he would never use any junk bonds to finance the Taj, got the approval, and then proceeded to use junk bonds to finance the whole thing.
Wow.
And these stories go by the board. So the great failing is that the canvas on which presidential campaigns occur is the TV screen, and I've never seen a greater failure by broadcast journalists. Broadcast journalists have been living off of the print press in every presidential election that I've ever seen, and this time they created a new set of rules, and usually you would have these panels with the reporter on it and other people to discuss the story. Instead, these stories get no airtime. They get absolutely no airtime. Now, and these are networks that are making fortunes off of covering the Trump campaign and who are giving him endless amount of airtime, but they won't give any airtime to legitimate stories that unveil what his real business practices are. And I think that's the great failing of broadcast journalists. Now, we used to actually have, just think back to 2012, Mike Isikoff, a great investigative reporter, was working for NBC, MSNBC, and he was doing investigative stories that were television investigative stories day after day and week after week. Linda Myers, where they fired both of them, right? And so they don't even try to pretend, the television outlets, to generate their own investigative reporting, and they ignore all the good investigative reporting that's occurring, some of which can be quite sexy.
Yeah, paying off people not to cooperate with a criminal investigation seems to me like that just seems.
Well, like 2 days after McIntyre's story ran, Anderson Cooper has this interview on CNN with the whole family. Now, these are not Ted Cruz's 8-year-olds. All right. They try to treat Ivanka as a grown woman. She's like the second most influential manager of the Trump organization. She's right on the stage, and all they ask is, "Do you love your papa?" She's a grown-up woman. She's a businesswoman. She's the one who misrepresented completely misstated the sale of the apartments. Donald Jr. did too. They're sitting right there on the stage. They have a piece of the action themselves individually. They don't ask Trump about it. They don't ask Trump's children about it. It's like this is forbidden terrain.
I wonder if it's not just a question of like sort of in the narrative arc that they're creating, they got to build them up first before they introduce this stuff. But I hope to get to that second act, frankly.
Yeah. Well, we all do. But then if it's all done, to promote, what I wrote in the new chapter to the book is I'm a sports nut. All right, I watch a great deal of sports. What's really happened is that there is no separation that I can see now between sports reporting and news reporting on the networks. It is the job of every sports reporter to portray a clash between the two worst teams in the National Football League as a clash of titans.
Right.
You got to promote every game. I mean, we've seen them promote every primary endlessly, every caucus endlessly. So it's you have to promote the game is the whole thing that goes on with sports reporting, and I think that's what's going on with news reporting now. It's not like they never ask Trump a tough question. They do. That's all part of the game. But it's that they have to keep the game intensely competitive. If this becomes, imagine, Sam, that Hillary is up by 13 points nationally and winning well in all of the swing states 2 months out of the election. How's that going to affect ratings? So everything has to be keyed now, just like it is with sports promotion. It has to be keyed to promoting the race. And that includes, if you're trying to make a race, then you can't say too much about the guy who may be coming in dead last.
Yeah.
And I don't know how conscious this is, but look, you can look at, what Moonves said from CBS about what a bonanza this has been. and it's just become. I always thought. I mean, it's not like a new revelation that ratings matter to producers of television news, but I didn't think it was the only thing that mattered.
Yeah.
Appears to be the case.
I think you're right about that. I think that's a fascinating insight. Wayne Barrett, we will put a link to the updated version of your book, Trump, the Greatest Show on Earth. Thanks so much for your time today. A real pleasure. Great to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you, Sam.
Hello, you. I'm Sam Cedar. Looking for smart progressive talk that is occasionally amusing? Well, subscribe to our YouTube feed. Subscribe to our podcast. Like us on Facebook. And just generally enjoy us.